My friends joke with me that if I'm out with people or I'm at a party or something, that I don't really like to talk about myself. What I like to do is to ask other people questions. And I find myself, and they've noticed that I slip into interview mode, that I'm constantly kind of trying to pull information out of people because that's what I do all day as someone who's a writer. So, this idea of the interview as conversation is really a key concept that I need you to grab hold of, because the more you can make a conversation out of your interview, the more comfortable you can make your sources, the better information you're going to get. So the interview is the cornerstone of all communication that we do, if you think about it. If you are looking to apply for a job, you are in the middle of an interview. If you are, pollsters are using it to try to gauge public opinion. Police use it every day to catch criminals. While you're in the middle of trying to get any information out in the world, you are conducting an interview. And it's also the key to how we convey information journalistically. But where we fail, I think, our readers, is when we start to look at them as interviews as opposed to conversations, because an interview can feel very sterile, it can feel very clinical. It doesn't really elicit natural responses. It may elicit factual responses, but not the kind of anecdotal conversation that we're looking for now. So, this is what they're for. Interviews are going to get us our facts, different responses to questions, quotes, as we talked about, examples and anecdotes, different context, background. All of these things will come from talking to real people in real time. So the first thing I need to do is to understand my story. What is my story about? What exactly am I going to look to convey to the reader? The next thing I start to do is this. I research. I'm looking for what the facts are in my story. So I may have the greatest theme in the world, I think, but if I can't find any evidence to support it, it's not going to be all that successful a story. So I'm going to research exactly what's going on, and then I'm going to look for what kind of information I want to put into this story. What am I going to need for the reader? And when I know that, I'm going to have an idea of what sources I'm going to need. And I need to make sure that these sources are ones that can provide the information. Now, once I get that information and I contact them, I need to work out when and where I'm going to be able to meet those sources. So you have to, be reasonable with people's time. Keep in mind, if you meet people at a coffee shop, it's going to be noisy if you're trying to tape record something. If you meet them in their home, it may give you an opportunity to see what their lives are like in their home environment. You need to think about, I always try to think about some questions that I'm going to ask when I get there, but I think more topically. So, I know I want to talk about the beginning of their career. I'm not going to say, tell me about the beginning of your career, because that sounds really stilted. But I will, phrase it in such a way that it sounds like we're conversing with each other. And I need to make sure that I'm asking questions that are going to get me good and usable quotes. So if I say to someone, boy, it sounds like, you had a really difficult childhood, they're going to be like, yep. So it's like, well, these stories that you're telling me about your childhood are incredible. Share with me this experience about, when you were homeless, or share with me what it was like. If I'm interviewing someone who was homeless, share with me, how did you get to school? Walk me through that process. And there's lots of describe for me this and share with me that. And that really helps people kind of go back in their own minds and be able to revisit a fact for you. So these are all the things that we're looking at in our research. How many angles are there in this story? How do we know which angle to take? And part of that will be driven by the publication. So if you have a magazine that's focusing on a specific area, that needs to be the angle that you're going to tackle with your article. So, I have a student who, as I may have mentioned, is her husband's a very famous cat judge, and she and her husband go all over judging cat shows. Well, she's also a non-traditional student who's, in her 50s and working on getting her bachelor's degree, and she's got a lot of really interesting pieces to her story. But if I'm doing a story for a cat magazine on them, I would need to focus exclusively on the cats, and that would help me determine which angle to pick. And then I have to kind of look at what order in which I'm going to ask questions. And this can be a really challenging thing, because if you ask questions in an order that offends your source, then you may have turned them off for good. What I look at is this idea of a bell curve. And I ask questions, I start to get in the easy questions over here, and then I build up to what might be the more challenging questions. And over here, and kind of in this range, is when I'm going to look at things that are more, they might be confrontational in some way, they might be sensitive, There are going to be things that that maybe the writer doesn't find as comfortable talking about, and the source may not find as comfortable talking about. But I'll have gotten this comfort level built up all through here, and it's going to help me when I get over here to try to talk about this point. And then I'm going to come out of here, and I'm going to, ask them some more what would be considered to be softball questions to bring us out, fairly gently and smoothly from this interview. One example I've used in prior classes with my students has to do with Kimberly Jacobs, that police chief we talked about. So here's the story that I wrote on Chief Jacobs for Columbus Monthly. And when I started doing the story, as I mentioned, I was focusing on the fact that she was the first female police chief. But I read an interview with her in some really obscure blog that mentioned the fact that she had a partner, and the person's name was Bobby, Bobbi. And I started thinking, that sounds like a woman's name. And I wonder if this chief is a lesbian. Now, I don't mean that to sound odd in any way, but if she is indeed a female police chief who's a lesbian, that would make her incredibly unique, in the sense there's only one other person in the world who fit that criteria at the time of the story. But you have to kind of think to yourself, how do I ask that question? So what I did is I asked a lot of sources that I knew who knew her. Would anyone confirm this for me? Is there any way that I could, get this information? Can someone help me kind of focus this? And no one would confirm this information for me. None of the other officers she'd worked with, other sergeants she'd been with, nothing. So I'm in the middle of this interview, and I'm trying desperately to think of what to do. And I'm, going through the whole interview, and we'd reached that point in the interview where I needed to start asking her some less delicate questions. So I asked her about, some of the harassment that she'd had as a woman on the force in her earlier days. And then at one point I said to her, she had told me that she works 7 days a week, and I said, wow, that must be really difficult on your family. Can you talk to me a little bit about your home life and what your schedule's like in regards to your home life? And so she went through and she actually mentioned Bobby, and then she used the pronoun she. And I was like, oh, thank goodness. So now the door was open, and I was able to say to her, it sounds like, rather than me coming out and just asking her, I said, it sounds like from your relationship with Bobby that you're actually another first for Columbus. And she was very open and embraced talking about being a lesbian and what that meant to her, and how important it was for her to be a good role model, and what this could mean for other women, moving forward in police work. So, it was one of those things, it could have gone well, it could have gone badly. I tried to be as sensitive as possible. And at the point we were in the interview, even if she had gotten up and stormed out, I had all the information I needed pretty much, but she was incredibly generous and incredibly open about that. So there are three different types of sources that we use, and we consider them to be stored, observational, and personal. Stored sources, of course, are documents. So things that research that you may do online or in a library setting or in public records. Observational are the things that we can see, the experiences that we have. And then personal, of course, are the human beings that we talk to. What we have to try to understand is the experience level of the people that we're interviewing. So, people who have a lot of experience talking to the media are going to be more comfortable talking to the media, but they're also going to have the potential to try to manipulate you. People who are obligated to provide you with some coverage are a different type of source. So, people who are legislators have a responsibility to report what they're doing to the public. There's also unintentional newsmakers, of course. So there's people who are involved in terrible situations, accidents, or crime victims. If you're trying to do a story on kind of a look back on someone who's suffered some sort of injury or injustice, those people may or may not want to talk to you. And then you have the idea of academics and experts and people who are very knowledgeable in what they do, and they may want to talk with you, but may give you kind of tech speak that you have to try to get them to step back from. And I often say to people who are very high level experts, can we bring this down to layman terms? If I were 10 years old, how would you explain this to me? And that really seems to help them kind of come back. So, this idea of taking notes is imperative that you get what's comfortable with you. You can use a notepad and pen if you want to, some type of tape recording. Your smartphone is invaluable for recording. The app iTalk I use constantly. I'm now obsessed with my iPad, as I'm sure you can guess, for the fact that this is an iTunes U course. So I will use Evernote. I'll record my notes in Evernote. I will type notes in Evernote, and I will take pictures of whatever's happening. So, I went and did a story on a construction project that was causing a neighborhood to be up in arms, and I took pictures of what was happening now so I could come back and write that more accurately. I recorded my interview with the Evernote, and then I'm typing notes frantically as we're talking so that I can get different descriptors and different quotes and make sure that I have accurate information. So the iPad in your hands is the most powerful reporting tool that we've ever had, ever, and I really encourage you to use it and check out some of the apps that I provided for you. So we've talked about this idea of on the record, off the record, not for attribution, non-background, deep background, etc. So, just be conscious of that. We also need to be conscious about recording laws, just before I forget to mention. So if you are doing a phone recording, and a great way to do a phone recording is by using Google Voice, which I've also given you the app for, but know the laws of your state. So, for example, the law in Ohio is if one person knows they're being recorded, like I'm recording a conversation with you, that's legal as long as I know that I'm recording it. But in a state like Maryland, we both have to know that we're being recorded. It is always polite to say to people, and it's ethical, hey, I'd like to record this, is that okay? And get people's permission. If they say no, don't record it, and I'll do that even if I put the recorder right in front of them. But it's important from a legal standpoint that you know. So I've given you a link to what the state law is, so I encourage you to check that out. Where do you set it up? Is it private or public? Do you do it in person? I do whatever I can. If I need to see somebody in person, like Jack Johnson or the chief, I go there. I make sure they're going to interview with me in person. If I'm doing a story, the home birth story, I didn't need to see all those moms in person. I talked to one or two of them on the phone. I went and saw others. So you really kind of have to weigh. And if I'm in Ohio and I'm doing a story with someone in California, I don't have a lot of choice. So we do what we can, but recognize email, social media, great way to set up interviews. Don't do your interviews that way. Very stilted, very limited in how they come across to the reader. So you're just, from an ethical standpoint, you don't know who you're really talking to. So I would avoid those. Think what are called open-ended questions, so questions that can't be answered yes or no or with a single word. As I mentioned before, think in notes, not questions. What topically do you need to know? Kind of go with the flow of your interview, even though your next topic may be, topic F, and the source starts talking about topic R. Go with it. Let them talk, and you can always come back to things. And this idea of the bell curve that we talked about. I think about every interview like it's chess. So I think before I ever ask someone a question, if I ask this question, what will be the answer to my question, and then how will I respond in return? And if I envision in my head that I could get a bad answer, I really reconsider that question, and it saved me. It's something I've learned over time because I've asked plenty of stupid questions in my life, and I have had people, really call me out on them occasionally. So what it does is it saves you the humiliation of that, but it also saves you a lot of time and respect with your source. If you think, well, if I ask this question, I may sound like an idiot, I'm going to back up a second and try to ask it in a different way. So, try not to ask too long, complicated, multi-part questions. There's an example of that in the book, Always Get the Name of the Dog, where we just ask so many questions the person doesn't even know what to answer. Don't be too conversational. This isn't about you, so, you can offer the occasional injection of something about yourself, but don't start to pretend that you're having coffee with a friend. You're not. And you're not there to make friends, and you're not there to take sides. You're not there to say, oh my God, I totally agree with you on some controversial subject. I use a lot of active listening. I hear what you're saying. I respect your position, because I don't want to take sides of it, and I don't want anyone to ever accuse me of doing that. So please look in Always Get the Name of the Book, Always Get the Name of the Dog, as we talk about these issues, silence, how you can kind of reboot your interview, how you can build in comfort level. These tricks of the trade will really help you when it comes to trying to get those questions answered in a way that's going to be meaningful for the reader.